Today on Triumph Talks, you will be meeting a brilliant and fascinating author. Franz Joseph Gayl is a retired United States Marine infantry officer. As an enlisted Marine in the 1970s, he had served as an infantry anti-tank assault man and later as a Marine security guard, aka embassy guard, in Germany. He went on to receive Master of Science degrees in Space Systems Operations and National Resource Strategy, and served as a science and technology advisor at the Marine Corps headquarters. His father, Franz Joseph Ferdinand Gayl, fought in World War II as an elite German paratrooper, Fallschirmjäger, also nicknamed Green Devils by his adversaries. His father fought in North Africa at the Battle of El Alamein, became a prisoner of war, and was transferred to multiple POW camps, including Camp Maxey in Texas. I had the privilege of publishing Franz's book full of his father's stories before, during, and after the war, titled Legacy of a Green Devil. Franz, I'm so grateful to have you join us today on Triumph Talks and learning a lot more about your book and your father's life. Thank you for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Melanie.
So the way that I run this show is I just have some basic questions that I ask each author that gives you a chance to talk more about your book. So I'm going to start with the first question, which is just real basic. Why did you write this book?
Well, the reason I wrote it is because the motivation was my mom. She was, my dad had a fascinating life, but near the end of her life, my mom absolutely wanted to write down the adventures that she shared with him and that he had. Mm-hmm. My mom suffered from Parkinson's in the end, and she wasn't able to complete the project. It's her inspiration. I just picked up the ball and finished
it. So you wrote your book for your mom. I know, having read the book as your publisher, that I would add to that you wrote this book for history, because you really capture a lot of important history during and after World War II, as well as some of the important things that your dad did that made a big difference in the world today. So I'd like you to share some of those things if you would.
Okay. Well, going back to the beginning, my dad was born in Berlin, Germany in 1921. After World War I, he grew up in a fairly wealthy environment in a suburb called Charlottenburg in Berlin. And his dad was a federal district judge in the Weimar Republic, and his mom, my grandma, was a pianist and had the chance to play in the symphony at times. So
wow, so she's very talented.
Yeah. So my dad grew up in the Third Reich, and he loved that period as a young man. Mm-hmm. Germany was, for a young man or for a young woman, was just a motivating time during the 1930s. He had several close encounters as a young man with Adolf Hitler. Once, when he was younger, Hitler allowed children to run up to his open car, mm-hmm. shake his hands, and then he also involved in one of his shows during the Hitler Youth. He was putting on a parade. Hitler came up to his banner and saluted him directly because he was the tallest guy, so he was in the center. So, I mean, these were memories. He just cherished those memories. Mm-hmm. My dad wanted to be an architect, and then and so that he wasn't quite done with the gymnasium, which is the high school. But then the war broke out. Hitler declared war on Poland, well, essentially World War II. Mm-hmm. And now it was all about service. So my dad wanted to go into some elite unit like the SS or something like that. And he couldn't. He was warned by my uncle Bruno, who said, hey, look, you can't do that because you're a quarter Jewish. And it's going to be found out real fast. And you are not allowed to go and apply at the SS. So my dad said, well, what's the next best thing? What can I do? What can I do to serve? Because that's all they wanted to do. That's all he wanted to do. He didn't care about religion or anything like that. He was just wanted to fight for his country. So then it turned out that the Luftwaffe under Hermann Goering was not quite so strict on racial background checks as the other services were. So my dad signed up for this newly formed occupation of Fallschirmjäger, paratrooper. He went to school with some of his friends, from one of them from Charlottenburg, who was also quarter Jewish, and was Gayl's stepson. And they went to school, and he taught there for a little while because he was kept back for a few months to teach. And so he did not end up in Crete. There were a couple battles that he missed because of that. He was held back to teach when he was still, he was an assistant teacher. Of course, he's assisting because he's like a private first class. But he did enter the war in North Africa when Rommel badly needed good infantry. And so it's not like they parachuted into Africa. No, they flew in and they were excellent infantry, and Rommel needed all he could get. My dad was worked in the Ramcke brigade, the Ramcke brigade, and that, of course, was the paratrooper brigade. And Ramcke himself is a celebrated hero during that time. And so they defended at El Alamein, confronted the British, the New Zealanders, and Australians. Very tough opponents. My dad was dug in with his MG-42 machine gun, and so they did battle at El Alamein. And at some point, of course, the British made the big breakthrough, and Rommel was sent back on his heels, right back across the North Africa. The paratroopers were all foot mobile for the most part. They didn't have enough assets to drive them around, so they kind of hitchhiked with Italians. They hitchhiked with anyone they could, and they marched a lot. And eventually,
so this is a picture here of your dad doing a lot of marching at that time. And I just want to point out, I'm going to bring up the book cover because we're going to talk more about your cover in a little bit. That's the picture that we use there to.
And he just showed up in a history book on Ramcke. No one in the family expected to see him there, and there's suddenly my dad.
So you saw this picture and said, "Oh my gosh, that's my dad."
That's my dad. Yeah,
very good looking picture, by the way. But
he was a machine gunner, MG-42. Anyways, they were captured because they were all on foot, and then the British were very good, and they'd send out these what are called long-range desert patrols, and they would go far forward doing reconnaissance, but they started rounding up prisoners too. So my dad ended up in British POW, and they treated him wonderfully. I mean, the stories that come back from North Africa, the Germans, the Italians, Australians, New Zealanders, British, they were gentlemen, all of them, enlisted officers. It was a much different war in North Africa. So my father ended up as a POW and ended up making an around the world trip. First he was in British, then he was in South African hands. and riding on a converted ocean liner, the New Amsterdam, which was turned into a troop ship. Mm-hmm. And he ended up coming into the United States and ended up in POW camps here, coming through San Francisco. He ended up in Texas, and then he ended up in several other POW camps because they were just filling up, and the Americans were shuffling them around.
So how much time total did he spend as a POW during the war? Do you recall?
All the way up through repatriation, but he was repatriated right away. I would say between 2 and 3 years. I'd have to look it up.
That's a long time.
It's a big chunk of the war because Rommel was defeated earlier in the whole scheme of things. Finally defeated.
You tell a funny story in your book. You have so many great stories. Your book is absolutely fascinating. But I know you tell a funny story about when he was a prisoner of war with the British and an escape he tried to make.
Yeah,
share just a little bit of that.
The British knew that if a British soldier was taken captive, his job is to escape, and so they understood that would be the Germans too. So this was expected because they were obligated to try to escape.
So they weren't out to just machine gun somebody down that was escaping. No, they're a little more understanding.
They treated him extremely well in captivity. I think he was one captive in a mobile platoon, a mechanized platoon, and he was just a passenger, but he was a privileged passenger. He was always the first to eat. He was the only one allowed to take sponge baths. They had a little bit of liquor for him. They had everything. They treated him very well, like a brother, because they were brothers. And one time he did try to escape, and he got onto a vehicle and tried to make it work. He knew English, so he could read from the gymnasium. And of course, they didn't come after him. He ended up jumping on a defective vehicle, and it tipped over because it was up on.
It was up on blocks.
It was up on blocks, and he
was being repaired, and he thought he was going to.
He couldn't see that, and he thought he was going to get shot, or he had no idea. And they came up to him, and they were laughing and laughing and laughing, and they grabbed a hold of him and say, "Come on, Franz," or Jager, or whatever they called him, and come on, let's go have another drink. So they went back to it was very embarrassing, but it was very touching too.
I love how you're able to show different sides of the war. And I'll just want to point out, I find it also very fascinating that you are a United States Marine and you're telling the stories of your father, who was basically on the other side of our country's battle in the past. And it's an interesting dichotomy to read your stories of him. And of course, as we're going to talk about in a little bit, he actually did immigrate to the United States. And so I want to hear about that. But your dad is a real, trying to think what the right word, Renaissance man in a sense. And even though he had fought for Nazi Germany, he was very much about good, I think, and bringing positivity and invention into the world. So one of the parts of your book that I just enjoyed so much was learning about what he did right after the war when Germany was just destroyed. Would you jump over and talk about that a little bit? And I'll bring up some pictures. So,
sure. He had the good fortune to be repatriated very early, 1945. Yeah, it was still in 1945 or 46, very early. And he went back to Berlin to join his mom, who had suffered the invasion of the Russians, the Soviets.
Yeah, I want to talk about that next.
Brutal. Anyways, she was there alone. She had to bear it alone. My dad was an only child. And his dad had passed away. But he went back, and he was determined. He had wanted to be an architect when he was younger, and he says, "No," he said, "I want to participate in the rebuilding of Berlin." as many young men and women wanted to. They came
Mhm.
back to their country and it was completely destroyed. At
Mhm.
least the cities were. And so he was a co-founder of a group, you could call it, it's called Eichkamp. And they decided to, as they were students, they were all student age. Some of them were active students. My dad was a student at the technical university. And they said, hey, let's do our part. And so they began to build an Eichkamp, which was essentially a school that did not care what nationality the students were and did not care about the ideological backgrounds. They were futurists. They said, we got to get beyond all this. We can never let this happen again. And of course, they were all young themselves. They were in their 20s. And I received quite a bit of publicity. And back in the United States and in England. And just to say that it was hard work. They were rebuilding destroyed structures to just make classrooms and such, and a dormitory. Women, men, they were hard as nails. Didn't matter if you were a woman or a man. Everybody pitched in. And many good pictures of everyone chipping in.
It's just fascinating to see how they rallied after the war to do so much positive and, like you said, things that were the opposite of what had been the Nazi ideology.
Yeah. Well, it was a crushing defeat for the young people who had experienced it in Germany, and particularly for the soldiers. And but I guess this was sort of a therapy for them, let's just get back on our feet again and fix things up.
And do something positive, something that helps people instead of tears things down.
Well, it received a lot of publicity. In fact, I think Eichkamp still exists today in some form in Berlin. But
so this is the building right here on the left.
That was the original good structure. I think that was the other ones were kind of haphazard because they did it by hand and tools.
Yeah, with whatever materials and tools they had.
That plaque is still there. Got a lot of attention. Everyone thought it was very neat, especially the Americans. And my dad ended up going on to a conference in the United States, 1946, 47. And he met my mom. Well, that changes everything. My mom's American. She's also an idealistic student, and she said she wants to do good things, just like my dad. Well, that of course changed his plan. My dad ended up immigrating to the United States, marrying my mom, immigrating to the United States. And
very German.
He's very German. I can't remember a time that I wasn't wearing lederhosen as a kid. I mean, my dad was all that.
Oh, I wish we'd have put a picture of that of you in the lederhosen.
Yeah, that's a sight. But anyways, my dad finished his architecture degree first at the University of Chicago and then in University of Minnesota. And then he began working for a major gas utility in Minneapolis as an architect. And he was a real adventurer, and he grew up around one of the lakes that surrounds Berlin. And he used to be out on the water all the time with his dad and his mom before his dad passed away. This was before the war. And so he loved boats and sailing and anything that had to do with boats. So he was determined to do the same thing in the United States. And there's a big, beautiful lake in Minnesota called Minnetonka. And so we had he procured all sorts of machines. we had a World War II Duck. We had an amphicar, which was built after the Schwimmwagen, which was a German amphibious sort of a micro vehicle. And so we had all sorts of fun when we were kids, my sister and I. He also bought an island, a 3.5 acre island, and we had these beautiful sailboats, two different times.
Mm-hmm.
But my dad was not just disappointed at the loss of the war. He was a little bit concerned about Western civilization overall.
Mm-hmm.
He was an ecologist from the very start, from the 50s, before we even knew what ecology was, or climate change or anything else. Reforestation, things he had learned at Eichkamp. And so he became involved with, he was fascinated by the hippie movement in the late 60s. He thought they were real revolutionaries of their own kind. And he really identified with them, although he's now older. And so one of his jobs, they started rebuilding. They built parks in Cedar Riverside, which is a part of Minneapolis near the university. But going back to Berlin, I didn't want to forget that.
Yes.
My dad was at war, so he couldn't be with his mom, who's alone in an apartment, a nice apartment in Berlin. Her building got firebombed, but not to the extent that they couldn't put it out. They did manage to do that, but the British did some firebombing in Berlin, and but she survived the war, and the apartment building actually survived. But then came the Soviets. Now the Germans, and I am German myself, I'm a dual citizen, and we brought it on ourselves. So, payback is what it is. And we were very cruel and ruthless Germans were cruel and ruthless in the Soviet Union. You're going to expect the same in kind. And when they came in, the only civilians that were left in Berlin, mostly, were older people, of course, but young kids in the Hitler Youth, and also young ladies, and the women who were minding the home front. And it was almost unimaginable. My grandmother was she was damaged by the whole experience, the Soviet invasion. I never asked her all the details, but I can only assume what kind of things went on there.
I know that in your book, excuse me, you talk about, you talk about the rapes they committed, and even the suicides that were happening.
Yes. Not in understanding the psychology of the whole thing. Stalin, who was in charge of Soviet Union, he allowed his troops a certain degree of latitude going into the Western areas, going through the previously occupied territories back into Berlin, because he knew the psychological effect that would have on any remaining fighters on the home front. We've done stuff like that in the United States too. Civil War, the burning of Atlanta and things like that. It demoralizes the guys at the front, and man, did they demoralize. And there were so many, I think, throughout Germany, that includes the American areas, but mostly in the Soviet, not so much in the American areas, but mostly in the Soviet, there were over 2.5 million rapes that they could account. Most of them went unreported, of the women. And many of the women, out of shame, there was a period there after the fall of Berlin, they just decided to commit suicide. There were many, many women who committed suicide because of the shame of what they underwent.
The millions, thinking of that happening in the millions, it's almost like a whole other genocide of a different sort.
It's a different sort.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what, it sure works on the soldier's mind to know that these things are happening. And also, it's something that in the oral history of Germany is not going to be forgotten.
Oh, but
And
it's mainly in the oral history. I had never read, and
these things,
I consider myself somewhat well read on history, especially World War II, and I had never come across what you shared in your book.
yeah, you can find some of it online if you look for it, and
Yeah,
that's where. But and then I had the stories from my family.
right. Your
But
the first person stories. I think that's what's so fascinating about your book is that you're able to share some of those experiences that we don't hear
yeah,
a lot.
yeah.
And
But again, there's good and bad soldiers, disciplined and undisciplined
right,
soldiers on all sides, every war. And the
right.
Germans were not kind in the Soviet Union. They were extremely cruel,
Mm,
probably equivalent crimes. That's
yeah.
where the final solution actually began. Was by the Einsatztruppen in Russia. So again, the
Yeah.
Germans brought it on themselves, and the rest is history.
Well, I'd
My
like to segue. I think this is a good place to kind of bring up the next question, which is just to ask, what do you hope people will take from reading your book?
I guess if someone else is to read, obviously it was mostly designed for family because they're very what do you call it? Parochial experiences. Although the war history is very interesting and unique, I think my dad was so complicated. This part Jewish German Fallschirmjäger who absolutely did not care about Jewishness or Catholicism or anything else, and uh, who was absolutely a great patriot, as so many German youth were. And yet and still he remained a futurist. He really was a futurist even when he was young. Uh, he wanted to be an architect because Albert Speer, the architect of Berlin, wanted to build a great city. And my dad, a lot of kids wanted to go into architecture to participate in that. But he was so humane. He couldn't imagine deliberately harming a person or an animal or plant life, anything living. It was just not in his nature. And
Mhm. That's just so ironic and
he was
who
remarkable.
he was at his core. I think that's probably true of a lot of people who are pulled into war.
Of
They're
course it
not
is.
they're not bloodthirsty. They don't want to
No,
kill.
no.
It's just the politics of the country that you
They're
live in.
they're doing as they feel their duty obligates them to do. Um, in fact, my dad and I sometimes he confabulated a little bit, but he claimed that he doesn't know that he killed a single man at El Alamein. Well, okay, he's firing a MG-42 from a reverse slope, and hitting the British and Australians that got wrapped up in the wire. He probably did, but he wanted to believe that he didn't.
Yeah.
And that's that.
That
And I will
probably
say that
helped his sanity to see
of all soldiers. I mean,
yes.
no one wants the outcomes that
Yeah.
happen, the violent outcomes in war. They do their duty. But my
Yeah.
dad, he was he was obsessed with humanity, completely non-ideological after the war.
Mhm.
Started with Eichkamp, continued in the United States.
Yeah.
And when he came to the United States, he already came out of Germany. He never wanted to go back to Germany. It was completely destroyed. And then he did not like the West German society at all, something he didn't recognize. He loved the Third Reich. He loved
Mm,
the Third Reich.
mm,
And as did so many young men and women.
mhm.
That was gone. That complete dream was now gone. Now he's in the United States. Now he sees a completely different culture. And he was convinced, in even as early as the 1950s, that the West, as Oswald Spengler once said, was in decline, and he saw that in the United States from a cultural perspective. He was very pessimistic about human society, being able to go into the future with the materialism that had developed post-war.
So there's a lot of really in-depth philosophy from your dad that you share in the book. And I think to the question, I think people reading it, you're going to learn a lot of history that you didn't know because of what you're able to share from a first-person standpoint. But I think you also do an excellent job of conveying the ideology, the values, and the wisdom of your father. So I really think your book, I know that you wrote it primarily as a family legacy, and it's a very lengthy book. I forget how many pages. I think it's over 300, and it's
lots
full of pictures. Do you know how many pictures are in it? Did you count?
No.
Oh, it's probably
hundred.
every bit as many as there are pages. There's a lot of really great pictures in it. Speaking of pictures, I want to just shift over now and talk about, as I do with all of the authors on this show, just talk a little bit about your title and the cover of your book. I know that Green Devil is within the title, and that wasn't the first title. I know you and I kind of went back and forth a little bit on. Tell us what you were originally going to title it.
Well, it was something pretty mundane, like Biography of a Fallschirmjäger.
Fallschirmjäger. And I said, we can't use the word Fallschirmjäger because you're primarily trying to sell us in the
even
US.
I have trouble pronouncing it sometimes.
And nobody's going to be able to recommend your book because they won't know how to pronounce it. I still struggle to pronounce it.
But what was kind of neat about they were nicknamed the Green Devils, I think, by the British, because they were excellent infantry. They were excellent infantrymen, and they were well respected. They did not get mixed up in all that really bad stuff. And they fought well. And as a Marine, we also have nicknames. So we got the nickname Devil Dog. And, the Germans gave us that name. And I thought, I think the Green Devil, people are going to be interested in that. And that's the nickname. That's from their reputation. And the Marine Corps, of course, got its reputation from fighting extremely well in combat and being.
I think that's a title that definitely works, and even if they don't know what a Green Devil is, it piques your interest, and it's at least something we can pronounce. So if you're just watching this and learning about the book and you're like, what is a Green Devil? Well, now you know. It's a German elite paratrooper, also known as Fallschirmjäger or Jager.
It was close enough. Close enough.
Thank you. I actually studied German. This is just a side note. I took German in middle school, high school, and college. I probably had 6 years of German. And unless you get immersed in it, it's so hard to. I think I can get some of the pronunciation right.
With any language. Like I'm trying to learn Mandarin now. With any language, you want to start young, because I don't have an accent in German.
You don't.
I'm not saying that my grammar is always that good, but I can. It's Fallschirmjäger. You know what I mean?
You got
so I can say that kind of stuff. Yeah,
you got that part at least.
But you got to learn the language when you're young. Otherwise, it doesn't get through the hard head.
So back to the book cover now. We talked about the title, and of course, there's a subtitle, but. The background picture that we laid your dad's picture over, that was actually taken. Is that one from Africa? Where did you find that?
No. That was, I would call that a propaganda photo for the Fallschirmjäger. That is not actually a photo, I don't believe. It is a drawing or a sketch or a painting. And where I got that, one of my dad's buddies, another paratrooper, who was in Germany after the war, he decided to write a book about his experiences in the war. My dad met him in captivity, so they shared a lot of experiences together. But he too was in North Africa, and he wrote a very detailed account that would not, you can't publish things like that in Germany because it would be considered, I don't know, maybe things are changing, but it would be called glorification of the Third Reich.
Oh, okay.
Behelligung des Dritten Reiches or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. We need to give us some German here. Yes.
Well, anyways, but he gave my dad and me, my dad had already passed away, but he gave me this wonderful, wonderful book, which is a treasure. It's a historical treasure because he had fought previously in Crete, and that was, and he'd also been on the Eastern Front for a time. I mean, El Alamein was tough, but not like those experiences.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but that's what that picture comes from. So I borrowed it from the cover of his book, and then I found the picture of my dad in another book.
That's awesome. I love it. It's a really great cover. I'm proud of that cover. So let me jump to the last question that I would like to ask you, is we have a lot of people who watch the show that are watching it to learn how to become an author like you have become. And actually, I'm going to just take a second to put a little plug in that this is actually your first book, but you have a second book, and I'll have you back to talk about that one as well. Okay. So as an author of 2 books, what advice do you have for aspiring authors?
I guess you have to like writing. Researching and writing is something you have to enjoy because it is pretty laborious, and the drafts never look very good, and they get rewritten and rewritten. I'd written some articles while I was in the military and since the military, so at least I knew how to write a short article. My mom, however, was a published author, and she was a very good writer and a good self-editor. So that's what I learned. I learned how to self-edit, not having somebody else always read it, but go over it myself over and over again, change it, the drafts. But you have to enjoy writing and researching, and you have to be passionate about the topic. And I'm passionate about the 2 topics that I've written on. I don't see any, I mean, maybe something will come to me. I don't see any purpose to write any more because I have to have the passion for the topic. I certainly had a passion to tell my dad's story. I certainly had a passion to tell the other book too.
Yeah.
But it has to do with passion, and it has to do with the discipline of doing research and writing.
Yeah. And you are quite a researcher. Like I said, your book is filled with history. It's a great history book. It really is. And the pictures that you've put in it are, some of them are family pictures, but some of them are just really important images from various times throughout your father's life that are really key in what's happening in the world, really. So, yeah. So this first book that we just talked about, of course, touches on a past war. And I'm going to have you back on the show to discuss the next book that you wrote, which is your effort to prevent a future war. So we'll just put a little advertisement in here to come back and learn about you. I didn't actually get the book cover set up to show people, but do you want to just state the title of it and just a little bit of what you're covering in that book?
Yeah, it's about I've been concerned for over 2 decades now. I've focused in terms of research and study, and I've been worried about what our relationship with China would become, and it's becoming exactly what I predicted back in the early 2000s. I'm no genius. I mean, that's for sure. It's just that I happened to be studying something, and some things jumped out at me. And if we cannot, unfortunately, we may fight China over something that is probably their business, not ours. And that's when that's when you can kind of determine winners and losers in advance. It has to
Yes.
do with their passion versus ours. And that book is a whole different topic.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's called The United States Will Lose the Coming War with China.
Yep.
And over Taiwan. So it's pretty direct, that title. And you are a researcher. You're brilliant, as I said at the start. You have a lot of education, and you also have a lot of experience as someone in the military. So it's very interesting. I'm looking forward to interviewing you about that book coming up. To all those of you who've been watching, if you just found us, I hope that you will take a minute and just subscribe to the channel, and then you'll be notified when there's another show to watch. And of course, we will be having Franz Gayl on here in the near future with his next book. And Franz, thank you so much for coming on. This has really been fascinating.
Well, thank you.
Amazing.
Thanks for publishing
Absolutely.
the book. You've been wonderful throughout, and I thank you.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure, and it's a time period that I'm fascinated with. I think many of us are. So it was a real privilege to be able to publish your book. And we'll see you here on the channel very soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.